Hello, welcome back to Get to Know the Bible for another session. Today we're going to be looking at the Gospels, the first four books of the New Testament. Uh, we're telling the story of the Bible. It's not a Bible study, but a study of the Bible, looking at people, places, archaeology, geography, history, and prophecy. Today we're going to be focused kind of on the geographical side or geography of the Gospels and kind of showing where Jesus went when he taught certain things and kind of tied into a timeline to give you kind of a visual of the ministry of Jesus as portrayed in the Gospels. We've been going through. We went through the Old Testament, primarily the historical books. We didn't touch on the poetical books yet, but we did go through the first five books of the Bible, known as the Law or the Pentateuch. Starting from Genesis, Deuteronomy, we went through the historical books, starting Joshua through Esther, and then we went through the 16 prophetical writers and 17 books and tied those into the timelines over here in the historical books. So all 16 of these prophetical writings took place within this time frame of these historical books, mainly in First Kings, Second Kings, Ezra, Nehemiah time frame, but some other areas as well. But you can look at past sessions to cover that. Today we're going to be looking at the New Testament. So we're going to be over here in the first four books of the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which are known as the Gospels, the good news. And then once we're done with a couple gospel sessions, we'll jump into Acts, which is the history of the church, and then move forward with the epistles, the letters that Paul and others wrote to the early church, kind of teaching them what the gospel means and how to apply it and so forth. But today, we're going to be focused on the Gospels. What are the Gospels? Well, these four books that we have, these four writings. Two of them were disciples. Matthew and John were disciples of Jesus. And then Mark and Luke, we meet later. We meet them in the book of Acts, actually. We have Mark was an early follower, and he was very closely tied to Peter at the time of writing. So a lot of scholars think the Gospel of Mark is actually the Gospel of Peter, which makes sense because there's a lot of eyewitness accounts that Mark probably didn't see, but Peter would have. And then Luke was a physician that Paul converted on his second missionary journey, and he became a very stout, not only disciple and follower of Paul, but he took notes and actually wrote the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, very detailed accounts of what had been recorded. So we have Matthew. He portrayed Jesus as a king, and Matthew was a Jew. Obviously, they all were, except for Luke. And Matthew's gospel is primarily for the Jews, and it's in the way it was written. So they portrayed Jesus as the king. The readers of was kind of targeted were the Jews. A key phrase of Matthew's gospel is the kingdom of heaven. And what's kind of prominent about Matthew's gospel is sermons. Some of these long dissertations, the Sermon on the Mount and others, where Jesus had these long sermons. And then the genealogy in Matthew, there's a genealogy at the beginning of Matthew, and it goes all the way back to Abraham to Jesus. Then Mark was the shortest of the four gospels. He portrayed Jesus as a servant. The readers was kind of targeted with the Romans. His key phrase was immediately. It's a very action-packed account of Jesus' life and miracles and ministries. Just moves along very quickly. The prominent miracles, a lot of miracles in Mark, and then genealogy, there is none. Luke showed Jesus as a teacher, and his primary audience was the Greeks, and the key phrase was Son of Man, and the prominent was parables. A lot of Jesus' parable teachings, mainly in Matthew and Luke, have most of the parables, and his genealogy goes back to Adam. And then John portrays Jesus as a son of God. His readers are for everybody in the world. Key phrases: believe. Prominent was Jesus' teachings, and there is no genealogy in the book of John. So those are kind of just a quick summary of the four Gospels as far as what they contain. What we're going to look at in this study is kind of the life and ministry of Jesus. We're going to talk a little bit about a timeline of the 3 or so years that Jesus ministered, what that looked like. And we're going to kind of show you a map where some of these things took place. And we're going to get you familiar with some of the areas that Jesus taught in, primarily Galilee, Samaria, Judea, Perea, and a place called the Decapolis. Deca meaning 10 and polis meaning cities, a place of the 10 cities. So we're going to cover that today as well and get you familiar with those 5 areas. Because once you kind of understand those areas, you're going to be able to follow the narrative of the Gospels a lot more closely as you read through them. So let's start with a little timeline. We have the beginning of Jesus' ministry. We have his childhood, journeys. He was born about 6 BC. And there's not a lot in this area in the Gospel about Jesus' life, mainly his birth. And then Luke has one account of when he's 12 in Jerusalem teaching in the temple. But other than that, there's not really a whole lot of Jesus's early part of his life. It picks up pretty much when he starts his ministry. And so we have the first year and a half or so, we have Jesus mainly in Galilee. He did go down to Jerusalem in about AD 27. And so he didn't stay in Galilee the whole time, but most of his teachings and miracles and work was up in the north, in Galilee, which we're going to look at. But that's primarily where he spent his time. I invite you to freeze the video at any time, now or in the future, to kind of go through this. I'm not going to read through each one of these items, but I suggest you do at some point. And then in the middle part of his ministry, he goes beyond Galilee. He goes up north, Tyre and Sidon, which is up in Phoenicia. He goes over to the Gentile side of the east of the Sea of Galilee, and back to Jerusalem again, and Samaria. And then the last part of his ministry, primarily the last few months of his 3-year ministries, he's going to be making a long journey to Jerusalem. And then, of course, we have the triumphal entry and Jesus' death and resurrection. So that's kind of a snapshot of the timeline. Again, I encourage you to freeze the video and look at those closely if you wish. What did that look like as far as kind of on a map? Well, this is kind of an overview of where some of the things that we read about in the Bible, like I'm sure many of you have read, it's kind of where they take place. So if you go up north to Galilee, as you notice, there's a lot. This whole list here happened in Capernaum, which is this city right here, the northern Sea of Galilee. And so that was kind of Jesus' home base for most of his ministry, started in Nazareth, but then he kind of moved on, and Capernaum was kind of his home base. A lot of his disciples came from that area, which we're going to talk about. But yeah, a lot of things happened in Capernaum. He went all the way up here to the north to Caesarea Philippi, where Jesus proclaimed him as Messiah. He went over here to Tyre and Sidon, over in Phoenicia. That was the farthest north that he went, that we read about in the Gospels. Then he had some activity here on the east side of the Sea of Galilee, in the Gentile area, where he fed the 5,000, healed the blind man, cast out some demons, and so forth. He taught down here in the Decapolis, which was the 10 cities I mentioned earlier. And then, of course, over here in Galilee, Lower Galilee, where he's born in Nazareth, you have the miracle at Cana. You read about second chapter of John, the miracle at Nain, and some heals some lepers and so forth. So some areas in the north that Jesus' ministries and teach happened. Then down in the south, he's over here in Perea, which is just east of the Jordan. He had some teachings on marriage and healed a crippled woman and a man with dropsy. As you can see, that this area here, a lot of things happen in Jerusalem. Those all tie in Jerusalem. We healed a blind man, and we met with Nicodemus and some other things. Here in Samaria, at Sinchar, which is Shechem, Jesus met the woman at the well. Read about in John chapter 4, and then of course Jesus' death and resurrection here in the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. He was born down here in Bethlehem. So this is kind of a snapshot in one view of where some of these things happen. And again, I encourage you to freeze the video, or if you get the slides, look at the slides and kind of look at that a little closer. When Jesus taught, he taught in in parables. And so these are just some. This isn't all of them. This is kind of some of the main ones that you're probably familiar with. These 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, contain parables. John did not have any parables. Of the 3 books, Matthew and Luke had the most. And some of the parables are shared between all 3 books, like the parable of the sower is in all 3 books. Some are in just 2 of the books, like the parable of the weeds is in Matthew and Mark. And then some on this page, you can see all these ones here: the wedding feast, the lost coin, prodigal son, and so on, are all in Luke. But this is kind of a snapshot of how some of Jesus' parables lined up and where they were taught during his ministry. So now we're going to look at a little bit of geography of Jesus' life and ministry. Like where was he? And we kind of showed you on that map a couple slides ago, kind of a snapshot. But now we're going to kind of dissect some of these areas. And we're going to start with Galilee, which is up here in the north. And then we have Samaria in the middle. And then, of course, Judah down in the south. We have Perea over here east of the Jordan. And then we have ancient Gilead, which we're going to refer to as the Decapolis. Because if you go over here to the right, this gives you kind of a snapshot of the same area, but more with some geographical features. Like you can see the valley, the Jordan Valley, and the river, the Sea of Galilee flowing to the Dead Sea. You have the ridge that runs along the west side of the Dead Sea. Those are all the mountains, like the hills of Judea and the hills of Ephraim. It's all here. Then we have, of course, the lower coastal plains. If you notice over here, we have the Decapolis. This is that area of 10 Roman cities that we're going to talk about, because Jesus spent, quite a bit of time over there preaching to Gentiles. And then we have Samaria in the middle and Galilee up here in the top. You see this ridge here with Mount Carmel at the point. Go back to the Old Testament. That's where you had Elijah challenging the prophets of Baal, right here on Mount Carmel. And you have the Jezreel Valley and some of the geographical features of Israel. Up here you have Mount Hermon to the north. Then you have Tyre and Sidon, and the Phoenician towns that Jesus visited on the coast. So that's kind of a snapshot of what that looks like. So let's go and start with Galilee. We're gonna show you what Galilee was, what it was called when Jesus lived there, the area of Galilee, and it was under Roman rule. All of Israel was at that time. But we're going to tie it into way back, about 1,300 years earlier. If you recall, when Joshua came up here around on the east side of the Dead Sea, and then Moses died here at Mount Nebo, and then Joshua crossed over and conquered a lot of Canaan. And then they had the allotment of the 12 tribes. Each got their allotment of land. That's what this is here. This kind of shows you the 12 tribes. And so if you notice up here in the north, we have Asher, Naphtali, Zebulun, and Issachar. Naphtali, Zebulun, and Issachar. This is mainly the area of Galilee now. So this ties back to those three tribes, a little bit of Asher as well, back when Joshua did the allotment 1,300 years earlier. And of course, it was part of the northern kingdom when Israel had the divided kingdom. You have Nazareth over here to the right, where Jesus was born. You have the miracle of Cana, John chapter 2, and then Nain. And then you have these newer cities of Tiberias, that was built by Antipas, Herod Antipas. And then up here in the north, you have Capernaum, and this is kind of the border, the Jordan River of Galilee. You have northern Galilee and lower Galilee. The next couple of slides has more information and more Bible verses we can tie in and talk about this area. I'm not going to go through those in this video, but feel free to, once again, freeze the video and read through that, or get the slides. And there's a lot of good information that will give you more insight to Galilee as far as how it pertains, not just in Jesus' time, but also in the Old Testament as well. But it's also the border of Philip, Herod's son Philip. He ruled this area up here to the northeast, where Antipas had Galilee and Perea. So that was kind of the divide here in the Jordan River. Just feel free to freeze those and read them. This is what it looked like. This is the Sea of Galilee, looking out from the northwest, up there in Galilee. This is what Jesus would have ministered, would look like back in his time. You have Nazareth, present-day Nazareth. This is the largest Arab city in Israel. A lot of Arab Israelis. And then, of course, way up to the north of Galilee, you have the Tel Dan, or the headwaters of the Jordan River, up by Caesarea Philippi. So all this water comes down from Mount Hermon, and that's where the Jordan River comes from. Then up there in the north as well, you have an ancient temple, the Golden Calf Idol Temple up there in Dan. That was part of the northern kingdom when they kind of rebelled against the worship of Yahweh. And of course, they were punished for it, but still the ruins today up there in the north. So that's Galilee. That's Galilee. Right below Galilee, we have a place called Samaria. Now, Samaria, back in the allotment from Joshua, 1,300 years earlier, was mainly West Manasseh, because Manasseh had East and West Manasseh. So it had quite a large area. So you have here in West Manasseh and Ephraim and Dan. Those are the three tribes that kind of made up the area of Samaria. Dan never quite settled in his allotment. He ended up moving way up here. That's why they call it Tel Dan, up by Mount Hermon. But he was allotted that land, and this is Samaria. In Jesus' time, same area, same three tribes, but this is the same area. And you have a lot of Bible history in Samaria, of course. You have Samaria was the capital of the northern kingdom. It's also, and it was present day, it was called Sebaste. It was two names it goes by. We have Shechem, which is Sychar as well. That's where Moses built his first altar when he first came to the Promised Land 2,000 years earlier. And then, of course, you have Mount Gerizim and some different areas. And so this is when the northern kingdom was conquered by the Assyrians in 722 BC. This is where they were taken out of the Galileans and mostly Samaria and Galilee area, and they were displaced. They were taken throughout the known world, and other people were brought in, so it got really mixed up. And that's why it's kind of a mixed race, and that's why the Jews down here in Judea in Jesus' times didn't really associate with the Samaritans. Matter of fact, a lot of times they wouldn't even travel through Samaria. They'd go around it. That's why Jesus talking with the woman at the well was so significant at the time. But this is Samaria. Once again, you can read through it on your own if you'd like. Here's some slides with some more information and Bible verses and so forth. This is what it looked like. The Samaritan foothills were a little more gentle than the Judean hills. They were a little more steep and jagged, so it was easier to get around, very fertile. And this is what it looks like today. Also has some drier regions. Then over to the west, it got a lot flatter when you get closer to the coast. This is the area that Jesus would have walked around as he was traveling through Samaria, which he did on a couple occasions. And then below Samaria, we have Judea, or old Judah. And the tribes the old ancient tribes, or the allotment of the tribes for Judah were Judah, Simeon, which is down here by Beersheba, and then of course Benjamin. They call it the Saddle of Benjamin. It looks like a saddle, it's kind of a small area, but it does have Jerusalem and some significant areas. And those are the tribes that made up the southern kingdom that was displaced by the Babylonians in 586 BC, which we've talked about. As you look at Samaria, there's a lot of history here. You have, of course, Jerusalem, and you have Bethlehem a little bit south of that where Jesus was born. You have Hebron, where Abraham built a temple. It's also where he's buried with Isaac and Rebekah and Sarah and others. You have En-Gedi over here near the Dead Sea where David ran and hid from Saul. Of course, you have the fortress of Masada down here. And then Beersheba, the desert oasis to the south. And then you have where the old Philistines used to live. They're gone at this time, but this is where you had Gaza and Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Gath, and so forth. So that's kind of Judea. And under Jesus' times, it was ruled by a Roman procurator, along with Samaria. And yeah, you can read more about it on your own. In this present day Jerusalem, up on a hill, you see the Temple Mount here, and it's quite built out now. But back in Jesus' times, it was a lot less, but the same location. As I mentioned earlier, the hills in Judea are a lot steeper, a little more jagged than they are up there in Samaria. A little harder to get around and settle, but it was settled. And then you have the wilderness of Judea, very dry region. Then you have this area called Perea, over here to the east of the Jordan. You go back to the allotment, if you recall, back when Moses came with the Israelites from the desert to the east here, around the eastern side of the Dead Sea, and they settled before he died, they'd actually allotted these three tribes. Reuben got this area here, Gad got this area here, and then half of Manasseh got this area, Bashan, up here in the north and northeast. And so those three tribes were actually allotted before they conquered the land. And that's kind of the area of Perea now. So Perea is over here, this area east of the Jordan. Basically, it used to be called Gilead as well. So in the Old Testament times, if you ever hear Gilead, that was this area up in here. And so the southern part of Gilead is Perea. And present day, it's Jordan. And it's a Jewish-Gentile mix. So there's both Jews and Gentiles. And it was ruled by Herod Antipas, who ruled Galilee and Perea. And this is where Jesus, ministered as well. And this is some ruins there now. You can go visit and see some of the ancient cities. This is actually the ruins of Pella, which was the capital of Perea. It's also one of the Decapolis, which we're going to talk about next. So this is the last area we're going to talk about where Jesus ministered and preached. And this is the Decapolis, the Deca 10, Polish city, the 10 cities. They're Roman cities, Hellenized, which means they have Jewish culture and spoke, Grecian culture and spoke Greek as well as other languages, and it was primarily Gentiles. So when Jesus went to the Decapolis, when the Bible says Jesus went to Decapolis to preach, he's talking primarily to Gentile population. And there was these 10 cities. The northern one was up here in the north, Damascus, which you can actually visit today. Some of these cities are still around. And then as you go south, Philadelphia was the most southern city. That's present-day Amman, which is the capital of Jordan. Then, of course, you have Pella here, which I showed you a ruin of on the last slide. And then Gerasa is present-day Jerash. And you can see those ruins over here. It's one of the most preserved Roman ruins in the world, not just in this area, but in the whole world. And it's quite an archaeological site to visit. So that was all part of the Decapolis, an area that Jesus frequented and preached. So those are kind of the 5 areas I wanted to introduce you to. And now we're going to kind of look visually on the track that Jesus took as he walked through his teachings, his life, the Gospels. As you read the 4 Gospels and kind of put them together, this is kind of what it looked like as far as in the order that he went places. So we're going to start with Jesus' birth to adulthood. All right, so here's Jesus' birth. His parents start way up here in Nazareth at the top. And then they have a census, so they gotta go to Bethlehem because that's where Joseph's from, Jesus' stepdad. And so they travel to Bethlehem. Jesus is born. And then Herod finds out about a king, and he's going to start killing people. So they leave down to Egypt for a year to 2 years until Herod dies. So once Herod dies, in a dream that Joseph's told that he had to go back. And so they go back and they head back up to Nazareth, and that's where Jesus is raised, up in Galilee. And that's the first part of Jesus' life. Then now his ministry begins. So he's up here, being raised in Nazareth. He comes down here to the south. His cousin John is baptizing, John the Baptist. And so Jesus comes and he gets baptized here. It's called Bethany beyond the Jordan. The fact that it says beyond lets us know it's on the east side of the Jordan. And there are 2 Bethanys, so this is one of them. The other one's near Jerusalem, where Lazarus was raised, which we'll see in a few slides. So Jesus is baptized, and then he heads past Jericho to the wilderness. This is a Judean wilderness, very desolate area. This is where he's tempted for 40 days or 40 nights. And after that, he goes around Samaria, and he heads back north to Nazareth. And then he starts his ministry up here in Nazareth. His first miracle we read about is the miracle of Cana, water to wine. And then he goes over to the northern part of the Sea of Galilee, and he calls Simon, Andrew, James, and John his first 4 disciples. And then he preaches and performs miracles all throughout Galilee. So there's a lot of ministry going on up here in the first part of Jesus's ministry. Then during those first years, he does not just, he's mostly up here in the north, but he does go travel down south. And we find him at one of the festivals, probably Passover. This is where he meets Nicodemus, the Jewish Pharisee who was curious about Jesus, and at night came and met him. And Jesus, John chapter 3, said, the famous quote, must be born again. And that was here in Jerusalem. And then he gets his disciples and he starts traveling north, and he goes through Samaria. Like I say, most Jews go around Samaria, but Jesus goes through Samaria. And then it's where he meets the woman at the well in John chapter 4, which is in Sychar, which is also the same place as Shechem from the Old Testament. Then he keeps traveling up north, and he goes back home, starts preaching. They don't really receive him well. That's where he says, the prophets welcomed everywhere but at home, and so kind of leaves. He has the miracle at Nain when he restores the widow's son. Then he heads back to the Sea of Galilee, in northern part of Galilee, and he has a Sermon on the Mount, and he does a lot of miracles, and he calls the rest of his disciples, and he teaches with parables, and he continues his ministry up here in the north. Then we have some of these stories you read about in the Gospels where he's walking on water and calming the storm and so forth. So we're going to look at that now. He's over here in Capernaum, in this area here. And he's going to go across the water down here to the Gadara, which is the Gerasenes, which is where Gentile area. This is where he heals a couple of demoniacs when he casts 2,000 pigs into the lake. That all happens here on the east side. But on the way over to that, he actually calms the storm. He's sleeping in the boat, and the disciples are scared. Hey, we're going to die. He wakes up, says, have faith. That happened on the way to the healing of the demoniacs and 2,000 pigs. And then he heads back to Capernaum, and this is where the woman, 12 years of bleeding, is healed when she touches his garment. And Jesus said, who touched me? And it was her. And this is where he heals Jairus' 12-year-old daughter, restored to life. That happens at this time. This is where he feeds the 5,000, and then he sends his disciples back by boat. And then he walks on water as they're getting caught in another storm, and he comes out and calms them. He walks across and walks on water and so forth. That'll happen in this trip. And then he preaches that harsh teaching where he says his flesh and blood will bring eternal life, and the Bible says many stopped following him. So some of his teachings didn't resonate, and people kind of got scared off or didn't understand what he was actually talking about. That all happened up here in the north during this time, kind of in the middle of Jesus's ministry, kind of going towards his third year. And then we have this where he goes a little bit farther out, when he goes up to Phoenicia and so forth, which is up here in Tyre and Sidon. And so he's down here in Capernaum, and he travels all the way up north. This is where Jesus praises the Gentiles woman faith and heals her daughter, and then heads up to Sidon, and then returns all the way back to the southern part of the Sea of Galilee. And this is where he feeds the 4,000. There's two feedings. You have the 5,000 on the west side of the lake, and you have the 4,000 on the east side of the lake, and he heals many back here in the Gerasene area, or Gadara. Then he sails back to Magdala. So as you can see, Jesus kind of crisscrosses the Sea of Galilee a few times during his ministry. This is kind of how it all lines up. He goes back to Magdala, and Jewish leaders argue, and they want signs, and Jesus leaves and takes the disciples and goes way up to the north. So he goes from Magdala, where Mary Magdalene's from, over to Bethsaida, where Peter and James, John, and Andrew are from, and then he heads up north. He goes all the way up here to Caesarea Philippi. And this is where Peter recognizes Jesus as the Messiah, the Son of God. This is when Jesus asked the disciples, who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you are the Christ, you're the Son of God. And that's when Jesus says, Peter, you shall be my rock. We shall build this church. That all happened way up here in the north, in Caesarea Philippi. And then shortly after that, Jesus had the transfiguration, where he was met by Moses and Elijah and transformed in front of a few of his disciples. That all happened way up here in the north. And now we're getting ready to head back south all the way to Jerusalem for Jesus' final journey. So they're way up in the north, up here in Mount Hermon, Mount Transfiguration. There are several hypotheses of where the Mount Transfiguration actually happened. A lot of scholars think it was Mount Hermon. Some think it was Mount Tabor or Mount Carmel, other places. But according to these slides, it happened here, and that's fine. Now he's going to head back to Capernaum. Then he does more teachings and miracles in Galilee. Then he heads towards Jerusalem. Comes down here to the Jordan Valley, cuts in, and then comes down to the bottom through Perea, according to this map. And then this is when he gets down here beyond Bethany into the area he was originally baptized, when he meets the rich young ruler, where he hears of Lazarus, his good friend's illness, death, basically, which is over here in Bethany. This is a Bethany that Lazarus lived in. This is a Bethany beyond Jordan, two different Bethanies. And then he crosses the river and heads to Jericho. And through Jericho, he comes to Bethany. And this is where he raises Lazarus from the dead. As he goes through Jericho, this is when you meet Zacchaeus, tax collector, and heals a blind man, Bartimaeus, in Jericho before heading to Bethany. This is where he raises Lazarus from the dead after being dead 4 days, where the woman anoints his feet. And now we're getting close to the end to Jesus' triumphal entry, Last Supper, death, and resurrection. Because Bethany is a short distance from Jerusalem. So then he heads, after raising Lazarus, became very famous, has a lot of followers at this time. The Pharisees and Sadducees are really not, they're really against him because he's getting very popular. And he comes in, and then we have, like I say, his triumphal entry, and then the Passion of the Christ, which we're going to look at next, what happened in those last week of his life. Before I get into the Passion of the last week, this is another road to Jerusalem that he might have traveled from the north. A lot of times they went down the Jordan River, but if you went through Samaria, you would have traveled, started in Capernaum, and you would have transgressed through some of these main cities here, including Samaria, Sebaste, and then Shechem, and then cut down this gorge here around, and then from Jericho, Jerusalem, this is the way that you travel, which goes through Bethany. So that's just another way of looking at how Jesus would have traveled. And it also gives you an idea of some of the elevations of the area. Let's look at the last week of Jesus' life. So he comes in the triumphal entry after healing Lazarus and raising him from the dead. He comes in from the east. He cleanses the temple. And then that night comes over here to the upper room, which is in the upper city, and they have the Last Supper. And then after that, he heads over to the Garden of Gethsemane, which is to the east of the temple, on the Mount of Olives. And that's where he prays before his arrest. He's betrayed by Judas, and he's arrested here in Gethsemane, and then taken to the house of Caiaphas, the high priest, where he's struck and accused, and then he's taken over to the palace, to Pilate, who sends him then next door to Herod, who sends him back to Pilate, who washes his hands and say, okay, his blood's not on my hands, and they were demanding that he be crucified, and he finally gave in. And Jesus was then crucified over here, Golgotha, just outside the gate, and then buried in the garden tomb, and then 3 days later rose again. That's kind of the look of the map of the last week of his life, just before the crucifixion. And then the resurrection, we have Jesus rising after 3 days. He goes on this 7-mile journey to Emmaus. Read about it in Luke chapter 24, where he talks to two of his followers about why he must have died and fulfill all the prophecies and so forth. Then he comes back, and then he heads up north, and he meets his disciples appeared at the Sea of Galilee, which you read about in John chapter 21 and Matthew 28. And then he heads back and ascends from the Mount of Olives. Just like the Mount of Transfiguration is questioned, there's different theories of where that happened. The same with the final ascension. Some think it was Mount of Olives. Other scholars think it might have been a different area. This map has it Mount of Olives, but regardless, after he met with his disciples for the last time, he gathered them together, and then he ascended. And that kind of summarizes Jesus' ministry. So we have the areas of Galilee to the north, Samaria, Judea, then to the south, and to the east we have Perea and the Decapolis. And that's kind of a map showing how Jesus kind of traveled around this area. So when you see, it wasn't a really big area, and Jesus went to a lot of areas more than once, sometimes many, many times, actually. So as you get more familiar with the areas, like I say, you can follow the narrative of the Gospels a lot closer. Hopefully you get more insight into the messages. And we're going to close with this. This is Luke 24, verses 44 to 49, on that road to Emmaus. He's talking to his two followers who do not recognize him, by the way. The Bible said they did not recognize him. I'm not sure why. Maybe he looked different or it was spiritual, but they didn't recognize him. And he said to them, "This is what I told you while I was with you." This is what he told them before he died. "Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law and of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. Then he opened their minds so they can understand the scriptures. When he says scripture, we're talking about the Old Testament, right? The New Testament doesn't exist at this point. So he opened their minds so they can understand the Old Testament scriptures of how he fulfilled them. And then he told them, this is what is written: the Messiah will suffer and rise from the dead on the third day, and repentance for the forgiveness of sins will be preached in his name to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. You are witnesses of these things. I'm going to send you what my Father has promised, but stay in the city until you have been clothed with power from on high. So he's talking about the Holy Spirit, which comes 10 days later at Pentecost. So everything that Jesus did in the maps I just showed you, and the timelines, was to fulfill what was already written about him. It was already written about him. So in the next session, that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about all the Old Testament, not just prophecies, but scriptures that are in the Gospels, the 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There's a lot of Old Testament references, a lot of Old Testament scriptures, and of course, a lot of Old Testament fulfillment of prophecy. And that will conclude our time in the Gospels. So with that said, we'll see you next time.